Do you know what this Bible study is about? It is about you having the opportunity, me, us, having the opportunity to stand back 200 feet from the most critical, acute problems of our life. Because see, sometimes when you're in it, you can't quite get clarity on the fact that what you're seeing is actually not what you're dealing with. That there is an invisible war that is waging in the heavenlies. And over the next few weeks, what I'm going to ask you to do is to step back a few feet, to see it, to be on the outside of that marital strife, to be on the outside of that difficult child, to be on the outside looking in at that financial difficulty. Take yourself, metaphorically speaking, spiritually speaking, take yourself out of it so that you can see what Jonathan got to see that day. That there is an invisible battle that is being warred in the heavenlies. And you and I have an opportunity to suit up, to put on some armor that works, and to go to battle and to see victory declared in our lives and in the lives of those people that we love. And so I want to invite you to take a step back. I want to invite you to look clearly at what it is that God is saying to us throughout these weeks that allows us to really influence and make a difference in the things that we are facing in our life. And this was the message that Paul wanted to declare when he wrote to the Ephesians. This was the important principle that he wanted to express to them as he penned what we now know to be the passage on the armor of God. It is a passage that you and I are going to look very closely at over the course of these 6 weeks. He writes in Ephesians chapter 6, beginning about in verse 10 or so, he says, "Finally, you be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. You put on the full armor of God." Listen, not a portion of it, not the part that's most convenient, not the part you like, leaving behind the part you don't like. He says you've got to put on the full armor of God so that you can stand firm against the schemes of the devil. And then he says, and this is the verse we're going to look at really closely in our time together during this session. He says, listen, for our struggle, it is not against flesh and blood. It is against the rulers, it is against the powers, it is against the world forces of this darkness, it is against the spiritual forces of wickedness that are waging in heavenly places. He says, therefore, you take up the full armor of God so that you can resist in the evil day. And having done everything to stand firm, he says, you stand firm, therefore. You make sure that you have girded your loins with truth, that you have put on the breastplate of righteousness, that you have shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. He says, in addition to all, you take up the shield of faith, because with that shield of faith, you're going to be able to extinguish all the fiery darts, the flaming missiles, some translation calls it, of the evil one. He says, and then you take up the helmet of salvation, and then you don't forget the sword of the Spirit, because that's the word of God. And then he says in verse 18, he says, with all prayer and petition, you pray at all times in the Spirit. And with this in view, be on the alert and have all perseverance and petition for all the saints. He closes in verse 19 by saying, you pray. Prayer makes a difference. In other words, y'all, there really aren't just 6 pieces of armor like we thought for so long. There's 7. Because without prayer, the others are not activated. Without prayer, the others are not infused. They're not plugged in so that we can tap into all the power that the armor is supposed to bring us in our lives. And so we don't just have 6 pieces to talk about over the course of these weeks. We've got a 7th. And it's going to permeate every single thing that we do throughout these weeks of Bible study that we have together. But for this particular session, as we launch into this first week of Bible study that I am so excited about, I have loved studying the armor of God, and I really do think you are going to as well. I want to just zero in on some principles from verse 12 that are going to help us to get a broad perspective that will allow us to see clearly and more impactfully what it means to put on the full armor of God. The first few words of verse 12 give us our very first principle that we want to look at tonight. He says in verse 12, our struggle. Some translations read, we wrestle. I love the very clear and emphatic and unequivocal way that he says this. He says, listen, let's be clear. We do wrestle. He says there is a struggle. There is a wrestling match that is waging. It tells us that no matter where you live, No matter who you are, no matter how comfortable and convenient and cozy your life may be, every single one of us are in a wrestling match. And listen, y'all, one of the most clever strategies of the enemy is to get you and I to think there is no struggle when there really is. He wants you to think you're the exception to the rule. He wants you to think that the cosmic wrestling match that is ensuing is not your battle to fight. But listen to me, whether you are black or white, whether you are Asian or Hispanic, you wrestle. Whether you are middle class or lower class, you wrestle. Whether you are suburban or whether you are urban, honey, you wrestle. All of us are in a wrestling match. Whether you are single or whether you are married, you are in this cosmic wrestling match that is waging in the heavenlies. By virtue of your relationship with Jesus Christ, you are automatically antagonistic to the things of the enemy, which means you wrestle. Would you please, even if you were sitting in a living room or you were sitting in a congregation with tons or a sanctuary with tons of people, would you please look at the woman next to you just in case she is not sure? Look her squarely in her eyes and say, girl, you in a wrestling match. In a wrestling match. Listen, you got to say it with some attitude. You got to look at her again and say, girl, you are in a wrestling match. Author J.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings, there's one character that looks over to another and says, I will not risk open war. And the character he's talking to looks back at him and responds, open war is upon you whether you risk it or not. And the reality is, y'all, open war is upon us whether we're going to be engaged or not. The choice is not yours whether or not you will, the battle will be experienced. The choice is only yours whether you're going to engage. And whether or not you will experience the victory that Christ has won for us on Calvary, whether you experience that in your regular everyday living, it all depends on whether or not you will choose to strap on this armor, to act like there is a war, and that your part in it really does make a difference. And so we learn that the battle is unavoidable. No matter where you live, no matter who you are, the spiritual war is unavoidable. If you want to find solution and resolve to your life's, my life's most pressing problems and pressing difficulties, you've got to come to grips with this. You're in it, whether you want to be in it or not. There is a bullseye that is on your back. Now listen, that's no reason for you to be afraid, but you better be on your guard. You better be prepared to stand firm against this enemy, because he wants you unstable. He wants your mind and heart in a state of utter peacelessness, riddled with chaos and confusion. He wants your most vital and potent relationships divided, and he wants discord and dissension to permeate throughout them. He wants you and I to be lulled to spiritual sleep and apathy and indifference so that we are not living victoriously and experiencing abundant life. There is a cosmic battle that has waged since before time began until now, and you and I are a part of this cosmic war. This is called spiritual warfare, and it is very real. As long as you think that your spouse is the problem, then you've missed the real issue. As long as you think that your coworker, that one that if she says one more thing to you, you're gonna knock her out, that one. As long as you think your coworker is the problem, you are gonna miss the real issue. And as long as you and I are targeting those people, listen, people are not your problem. And as long as we are targeting them or those issues, we have missed altogether what will be effective in influencing and changing the landscape of our experience. The battle is unavoidable. But that's not all he tells us in verse 12. He says, for our struggle, listen, he's about to tell us what it is not, and then he's going to tell us what it is. He says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness. He says, I want you to know, not only that the battle is unavoidable, but the enemy is invisible. You are not to target your frustrations, your words, your solutions, your resolves, your best effort, they are not to be targeted at the people or the things or the circumstances that you can see. Flesh and blood, what you can sense with your hands, what you can feel, what you can see with your eyes, what you can hear with your ears, what you can smell and touch, what your five senses allow you to relate to in the physical realm. None of that is really your problem. Your real enemy, the one who is behind the scenes controlling so much of what is going on in our experience, he is an invisible enemy. And here's the thing, he wants you to think that just because he's invisible, he's also fictional. But he is very real, and we have to grasp the fact that yes, the battle is unavoidable, but the real enemy is not what we can see. He is invisible, but very, very real. His effects are seen and sensed in our regular everyday living. I take my boys to this church that is very near to our house. It's a smaller church. We love going there. They have a harvest festival in the fall. And we love going there because all of these parents that are a part of that church, they all volunteer to bring their cars. They park their cars in this back parking lot. They all open up their trunks. And out of their trunks, they create like these little fair games or these little carnival type games. And the kids can go from one trunk to the next trunk and play a little game and have a little fun. So we enjoy doing this harvest festival. And there was one game that my little Jude loved the most. I have 3 boys. Listen, when I started doing Bible studies, my second son was 3 months old. Now that second son is getting ready to be 11 years old. And my oldest son is getting ready to be 13 years old. He's going to be a teenager. And then we have our little surprise one. We don't still actually know how he got here. He is now 6 years old, and his name is Jude. We named him Jude on purpose because that is as close as I could get to Revelation. Because it is finished. It is over. It's over. So I have these 3 little boys. And Jude is the one I had with me at in the back of this particular car. It was actually a truck. And what they had done was build some little stairs that allowed kids to walk up into the bed of this truck. And beside the bed of this truck, they had crafted sort of a wooden tabletop of sorts, and they had draped it with a curtain. There were holes in the top of this wooden tabletop. And while the kid was standing in the bed of the truck, they would give him or her a little plastic hammer. And these puppets would pop out of the holes. It was a homemade whack-a-mole game. So all these puppets would pop out of the holes while the little 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds would stand there and they would try their best to pop down all of these puppets that were popping up through the holes. Well, there was this one little kid that was behind us in line. He must have been about 4 years old, cutest little thing, and the line was taking too long for him. And plus, as he watched, he was so frustrated that every time you hit a puppet, another puppet came up. I mean, he just couldn't fathom why this was happening. It didn't seem right to him, logical to him. It didn't make sense. So out of nowhere, just a blur out of my peripheral vision, this little sweet 4-year-old ran over to this curtain and just ripped the whole thing down off that cardboard tabletop, revealing 6 adults that were sitting underneath. They looked like deer caught in headlights. It was hilarious. So all these adults are completely exposed. Everybody giggled and laughed as this little boy revealed that the puppets were not the problem. That underneath the surface, there was a real culprit that was causing all of these things to pop up on the surface. And if we spend all of our time just hitting at all of the symptoms that are popping up in our life, popping up in our marriage and popping up in our own hearts and popping up in our actions and popping up in our finances, if we keep just popping the puppets and never deal with who is behind the curtain. Y'all, this Bible study is about you stepping back 200 feet and really understanding and discovering who's behind that curtain and pulling it back once and for all and letting the enemy know that we've got our eyes on you. We're kind of tired of you messing up our stuff. We want you to know that we are fully aware that you are behind some of the stuff that is happening in our life. Once you pull the curtain back, you can deal with who needs to be dealt with. And you can aim your strategies and your weapons in the right way so that they can be effective. Now, I want to be clear.